The rain began with the kind of patter you almost welcome on a tent roof. Soft, steady, lulling. I remember leaning back against my pack, boots off, thinking how smugly dry I was. My gear had come with a big promise, stamped right on the label: waterproof. I believed it. Why wouldn't I? The tent walls glistened with droplets rolling harmlessly down, the smell of wet pine drifting in through the vents. Out beyond the clearing, thunder rumbled, and the fire we'd coaxed to life hissed itself into smoke. By the time I zipped the tent flap shut and lay back, I was half convinced this was going to be one of those cozy nights. Storm outside, dry inside. Maybe even a story to brag about later. But it was when the thunder cracked closer and the rain stopped pattering and started hammering that I caught the first hint of betrayal. A cold kiss on my forehead. I brushed at it, thinking it was sweat. Then another, right on the bridge of my nose. I sat up fast. Overhead, where two seams crossed like an old scar, the droplets had begun to gather, fatten, and finally break free, falling with the kind of rhythm that makes you realize you're not imagining things. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the fabric. That's when the truth hit. The so-called waterproofing was no more than a fairy tale. Tiny beads glistened all across the ceiling, shimmering like stars in the beam, each one ready to drop at the worst possible spot. It didn't stop at the ceiling either. The floor had its own secret. A slow, invisible seep was rising through the bottom, creeping into my ground sheet, and working its way toward my socks. I slapped my palm down and felt the unmistakable cold of water where there should have been nothing but nylon and dirt. My pack was leaning against the corner, and already the edges of my sleeping bag were drinking in the wet. That was the moment, the sharp, undeniable moment, when I realized my waterproof gear was nothing of the sort, and I knew the long, wet night had only just begun. Now, when you're in the woods and realize the sleeping bag, a nice, lofty down bag that had always been my pride and joy. It was supposed to be the kind of gear you brag about. Packs small, keeps you warm even in the shoulder seasons. But the moment water found its way in, all that down collapsed into sad little clumps. I stuffed one side under me to try and block the rising damp, but that just left the other half exposed to the drip, drip, drip from above. After an hour, I gave up pretending to sleep. I sat there cross-legged, headlamp on, watching the water inch across like it was claiming territory. The smell of wet nylon mixed with the earthy musk of soaked soil underneath. Every time I pressed a palm to the ground sheet, I felt the cold push back. My so-called waterproof tent wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a colander with aspirations. The worst of it was knowing there was no easy fix. I had no tarp, no extra plastic, no clever trick to keep the flood at bay. My only defense was a handful of trail snacks, a damp sense of humor, and the stubborn hope that the storm might wear itself out before I did. But storms rarely play fair in the backcountry, and this one had all night to work on me. That's when the thought crossed my mind. Maybe, just maybe, I'd be better off outside the tent than in it. So, I made the decision. Staying in that soggy tent was like waiting for a ship to sink with me still on deck. I grabbed my jacket, another piece of waterproof gear, mind you, and unzipped the flap. The storm greeted me with a slap of wind and a spray of cold needles right in the face. For a moment I stood there, staring out at the trees swaying like drunken dancers in the dark, and wondered if I'd lost my mind. But the idea of sitting in that puddle all night was worse. I pulled the hood tight, hauled my pack onto higher ground, and stepped out into the storm. The jacket lasted about 2 minutes before it surrendered. Water ran down the sleeves and pooled in my elbows, then worked its way past the zipper until I felt it trickling down my chest. I laughed, an honest, wild laugh, because at that point, what else could you do? I trudged to the fire pit, now a drowned cirque cloak, and sat there listening. The forest was alive with sounds. The rush of water through hidden gullies, the crack of branches snapping under the weight of wind, and, somewhere out there, the steady croak of frogs who clearly didn't mind the weather at all. The smell of pine pitch was sharp in my nose, mixing with the wet earth rising all around me. I realized then how small I really was out there. A man with his faulty gear, trying to wrestle comfort out of a storm that had the upper hand. But even in that moment, soaked, shivering, clothes plastered to my skin, I couldn't help but marvel at the raw power of it all. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real, and it reminded me why I kept coming back to the woods in the first place. Still, as the night dragged on, I found myself wondering how much worse it could get. The storm kept on like it had a score to settle. I huddled there beneath the spruce boughs, rain dripping from every needle, my sleeping bag now nothing more than a heavy, damp quilt. I must have dozed a little, because the next sound wasn't rain or thunder. It was different. A low rustle, deliberate, just beyond the edge of my headlamp's weak glow. Now, every camper knows the difference between a branch dropping in the wind and something alive moving through the brush. This was no falling pine cone. I froze, holding my breath, ears straining. The storm had quieted just enough for the shuffle to stand out. Another crack of twigs. Then, a pause. Whatever it was watching me as much as I was listening to it. My first thought, naturally, was bear. My second thought was that my food bag, which I'd hastily slung in a crook of branches earlier, probably wasn't hung nearly high enough. I fumbled for my flashlight, swept it across the dripping understory, and caught two eyes shining back at me. Small, low to the ground, glinting gold in the beam. Not a bear. Too low, too close together. The creature stepped forward and resolved itself. A raccoon, fur plastered flat from the rain, tail dragging like a soaked rope. It looked about as miserable as I felt, though clear to the tree line, half expecting another pair of eyes to appear. The storm finally began to tire, the rain easing into a drizzle, and the first gray hints of dawn crept between the branches. I'd made it through, soaked to the bone, nerves frayed, but still intact. As the morning light grew, I realized just how much of a wreck my little camp had become. The tent sagged like a defeated soldier, pools of water shining on its collapsed roof. My boots were still half full of rainwater. My gear smelled like a swamp, and my stomach growled for something more than soggy trail mix. But as miserable as it all seemed, I couldn't help grinning, because that's when it hit me. The trip wasn't ruined. The storm had humbled me, sure, but it had also handed me a story worth telling. When the sun finally broke through, it felt like someone had lifted a blanket off the whole forest. The dripping slowed. The birds returned with cautious calls, and light spilled through the trees in golden shafts that made the wet leaves glitter like jewels. I crawled out from under the spruce with stiff legs and a back that felt like it had been pressed against rocks all night, which, in fairness, it had. My first order of business was laying out the wreckage. Sleeping bag, tent fly, jacket, even my socks, all draped over branches like some kind of sad outdoor laundry line. Steam rose as the warmth hit them, and for a moment I just stood there, eyes closed, face tilted to the sun, soaking in the heat like a lizard thawing after a long cold spell. Breakfast was nothing fancy. Half-crushed granola bar, handful of trail mix. But it tasted like a feast. Each bite grounded me, reminded me I'd made it through. The forest had gone from roaring monster to gentle companion in the span of a few hours. That's always struck me about the outdoors. One moment it's teaching you humility, the next it's offering you peace. I spent the rest of the morning patching up camp as best I could, wringing water from gear, stomping my boots dry against a rock. The raccoon hadn't come back. Maybe that's the point. Because sitting here now by the fire, telling you this tale, I wouldn't trade that long, wet night for anything. It taught me that sometimes you only learn what you're made of when the seams start to leak. And though the storm stripped me of comfort, it handed me resilience. And one heck of a campfire story.